Hi guys, Genshin Scientist here. Some days ago I announced to you all in a community post that I will start this series. And before I start talking about this video's main topic, let me explain what's the difference between this and my other types of content. In this series, I'll try to highlight the aspects of a specific theme or character that generally don't get talked about much. The Theorycrafting community mainly focuses on few key aspects when it analyzes things in Genshin, and when it comes to themes, for example, the total team DPS or a full rotation is what often jumps out. However, that element alone isn't quite enough to analyze a theme fully, since it doesn't tackle some factors that apply to real game scenarios. In this video I will go over the Quicken theme structure, and what realistically makes it so good, with mathematical proof on the side. Let's start from the basics. Quicken is an elemental reaction that plays out quite differently compared to most other reactions in the game. As long as you apply Electro and Dendro together on an opponent once every 8 seconds, he will receive amplified damage from attacks that apply Dendro or Electro during that time frame, regardless of the successive elemental gauges. This is a different type of behavior compared to something like Vaporites, which strictly requires the opponent hit by the Hydro or Pyro attack to have Pyro or Hydro applied on him respectively. This factor not only makes Quicken teams easier to play in practice, as they play out similarly to reactionless teams, but it also gives them objective advantages in multi-target scenarios compared to other more restricted reaction-based teams. The issue for the latter in AoE situations is that it's hard for them to apply the right amount of elemental gauge on every enemy, and as a result their damage will drop down against secondary targets. Let's take Rational as an example, the Raiden variant of the National theme. This theme uses Xingqiu as an Hydro applier to allow Xiongling, the highest damage dealer on the team, to hit Vaporites consistently. However, Xingqiu is for the most part a single target applier, which means that for the most part, Pyronado hits on secondary targets will not proc Vaporites. On the opposite, Quicken teams are able to maximize their elemental reaction procs consistency quite smoothly, since even single target appliers like Yai or Fischl can easily enable Quicken on a multi-target scale, since they will only have to hit a specific opponent once every 8 seconds to allow the damage dealt by the whole team to get amplified. The benefits are massive, because AoE damage dealing characters like Nahida or Kazuha when it generates Electro through his infusion or swirls will become absolute powerhouses for your teams. Specifically, Nahida is a character whose damage is often underrated, because her single target performance is in that low end off-field sub-DPS range. However, her main perk is that her elemental skill will always hit every opponent marked by hit, when any elemental reaction is triggered. This type of consistency in AoE scales very well with the Quicken functioning I just talked about, and it catapults Nahida into a much better range of damage when she's facing multiple targets. I'd dare say, if there are 3 or more targets on field, Nahida is probably close to being a top tier off-field DPS. It's not only Nahida who benefits, of course. On-field carries like a Hitam, so characters whose base damage is quite high as a baseline will have tremendous repercussions on the opponent's lineups if their attacks manage to hit on an AoE scale. Basically, Quicken is one of the elemental reaction-based teams who has the best potential performance in AoE scenarios, and this just makes it extremely consistent. It doesn't end here, however, as Quicken teams also have other peculiar aspects compared to most other teams. Specifically, many Quicken teams have rather short setup time, which allows them to start dealing their significant rotation damage quicker than other teams. Note that this doesn't mean their damage is higher, it just means their damage is more evenly distributed throughout the entirety of the rotation, as opposed to teams like Huta or Vaporize, who only start doing damage around halfway through their rotation. The main benefit of this is that they can start putting pressure on opponents and maybe kill some faster than other teams, which can be quite useful if said opponents have disruptive move patterns and need to be dealt with quickly. Part of the reason Quicken teams have shorter setup time is that spread carries really don't need much in terms of support activity to amplify their damage, as they just really need the Quicken reaction to be enabled and Nahida's burst to be active, Somebody that takes full advantage of this aspect is a high constellation Tighnari. Tighnari has extremely short windows of damage for a carry, and at high constellation investment level, he will inflict massive damage during those time frames. The effective result is that Tighnari is one of the best characters for speedruns, because his damage window can end before some other carries' window even start, which can be tied to supports like Kazuha simply taking longer to do their thing, or simply the time required to apply the right elemental gauges on opponents. We don't have to go as far as high constellation level to prove this point for Quicken teams, however, as there are clear examples of this even at low investment. For example, the Quicken setup with Yae and Fischl as main electro carries starts doing damage very early in the rotation, as neither Yae or Fischl requires particular fuel time to do damage. The result is that the team will deal good damage during the setup time, and halfway through the rotation it will have already dealt enough single target damage to defeat most non-boss opponents. Still, this isn't necessarily a positive all the time. For example, against bosses that have a long initial idle phase, teams with long setup time can simply start the rotation during the idle phase and start doing damage as soon as the boss becomes vulnerable. In those scenarios, Quicken teams lose their advantage of speeding things up entirely. Anyway, all of this was to say that overall, Quicken teams have some of the most flexible damage profiles in the game, and that's something you might not notice if you just glance at their overall team damage. I'm done for today. Let me know what you thought about this first episode of the new series in the comments below, and if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time!